Japan's been making great cars for an awfully long time, and yet for some reason they are fallen so far behind when it comes to battery electric vehicles. And I want to come up with some ideas that would explain why. I'm Brian. Welcome to my Tesla weekend. So Lee from Tesla Economist, right over here, is joining us to come up with to share some of his brilliance and wisdom and ideas as well. Now, Lee, you know a couple things about electric cars. When the Nissan Leaf came out a long time ago, did that convince you that that Nissan, at least, was moving in the right direction on battery electric?
I guess it was one level higher than the Prius going fully electric, but the convenience of 100 miles of range, or was it even less back then, 70
It
miles of
was
range or something?
it was less
It
on the
it
first generation.
yeah, it's not convenient. It's not going to be mass market. It's not going to be useful for a lot of people's lifestyles, and it's not a particularly nice car at all, in my opinion.
Right, right.
It's
And
not
I've got some
cool
thoughts on that we'll
or
get to as
sexy.
well. And the same thing when Toyota came out with the Prius, they sold like hotcakes, and I thought, well, this is one step away from full electrification. Surely they could. The car already works. Just replace the gas drivetrain with more batteries, and you're back in business. But they just didn't. So my theory is Japan and Japanese car makers, both of them independently, hate electric vehicles. And the Nissan Leaf was a compliance vehicle. They didn't want to sell it. That's why it was so ugly. That's why it had such a short range. And at least here, most people who bought it didn't pay the $35,000, $40,000 it cost. They got it on a lease for like 100, $200 a month for 3 years. And at the end of it, nobody bought it out. And then you could buy them secondhand for $5,000, $6,000. So Nissan was losing a considerable amount of money. Like most of the cost of the vehicle was lost. And that tells me you can't scale when you're losing money. You know, Toyota has had electric cars going way back. They've had electric car programs since like the 80s and 90s, but they were never serious. Do you know the electric Rav4? Do you remember that one?
No, I didn't know there was a completely electric one back in the 90s, you're saying?
Oh, the late 90s, yes. The early
Oh, wow.
2000s, I guess I would say. They had made one in Japan. It wasn't very serious. And then they made thousands of the electric RAV4 in the 2000s. Or rather, they shipped them to this young company in Fremont called Tesla, who electrified them for sale.
Right,
So
right,
it was a Tesla. It was
right.
like the Roadster 1.5. But Toyota never took it seriously. And Honda, I mean, even now they're not very serious. So if you look at those three brands, you've got Nissan's finally making the Aria, which is fine. You've got Toyota making the Buzz Forks, which is, I guess, fine. They sell more in Europe than they do here. And then you've got Honda, who's got that, I forget the name of it. It's a cute little car, but it's got like 100 miles of range.
hmm
So why do you think Japan doesn't like electric cars?
The economics behind the Japanese car, it's an affordable, low-cost car for the masses, and batteries have a certain fixed cost, no matter what. No matter if it's a Mercedes, a Toyota, whatever. If you need a 60 kilowatt hour battery, it costs about the same. Whereas engines are different for different reasons, on different performance, reliability, specifications, etc. A battery is more a generic product, but it has a fixed cost. So if you have a car that's selling for about $20,000, $25,000, you're going to have this $10,000 battery drivetrain cost for electric car, which is going to eat into your profits a lot and your costs. Whereas you can get an engine for a lot cheaper. Whereas Mercedes might have same battery and it costs the same, except the car is $40,000, $50,000, and they can offset that higher cost with their brand. Whereas Toyota, Nissan, these are low, well, they are budget brands essentially, which is why, they did so well in the 70s and 80s in the US when gas prices were so high, and because they came in as these low cost, small, compact, efficient cars. But now the only way they can really compete, in my opinion, is they have to have small batteries. And like you're saying, this Honda with 100 or so miles of range, and even a Toyota BZX4, whatever, and that Mazda, whatever the electric Mazda was, which
MX-30,
is like it's
yeah,
MX-30, which is what 130 miles of range or something.
if that. It's terrible.
Right. And I think this is why we're seeing them have such low range because they can't justify a massive battery pack and giving 300 miles of range or even high twos. They have to keep within their brand and their price points that their customers are willing to pay. They can't build a car, an electric car, as low a cost as Tesla offering 300 miles of range. They just can't simply do that. So how can they compete? They're going to have to offer lower range. And that, I think, is their basic issue with electric cars for these legacy brands. On top of that, they have all their other costs like unions and the dealerships, which all eat into the profits along the way, all those middlemen and stuff. So it's whereas Tesla obviously they don't, and they just directly compete selling to the customer. And Tesla can make they can have batteries in-house even eventually, but they're getting CATL cells and they're getting so efficient out of those with their drivetrain, which is low cost. And then, they use LFP in Toyotas and stuff as well, but it's just not going to get much range. So that is the issue. They can only compete with lower range, but then they're still going to be at similar price points to the new Tesla. I mean, well, probably the new Tesla model, whatever you want to call it, the compact version, it's going to have more range again, probably 250 or something miles of range, and under $25,000, especially after a tax credit. The Japanese will really struggle to compete with that in any sense, really. So that is, I think, is the problem, and that's why I think they're not transitioning over to electric or making a big fuss about them when compared to many of the other brands like Ford or GM or especially Mercedes, because they have a brand that is at least higher that people are willing to pay more for and can hopefully eventually cover the costs of these batteries.
Those are actually really great considerations. One you touched on was their unions, and one thing I had read, and maybe you know something about this, is that apparently they are somehow committed to their supply chain in ways that other car companies aren't. That maybe it's long-term contracts, maybe it's tradition, I don't know, but that factory that makes V6s is not about to retool and start making batteries. That's not a logical leap. And I wonder how much of the hesitation comes from the inability to redefine the supply chain.
I think you're right as well. That's definitely a good point. And you're probably familiar with Toyota City, right? Population of about 300,000
I am not.
people. All the whole city basically designed around making Toyotas as ICE cars. I mean, that's a good point. That would be hard to suddenly transition and transfer all these plants or downsize them or remove them and the jobs as well. Um, yeah, that would definitely be another point because I mean I think the Japanese they think really long term ahead and they plan accordingly. Decades and decades, or almost some corporations look at a century ahead and plan according to that in that nation. So it's not so easy to then suddenly change stream for a whole new technology when you've set up this infrastructure in already to go for long term. Yeah, so I agree that that's definitely probably a good point when it comes to Japanese manufacturing.
Another consideration that I had that I haven't read as much is, except for LFP, when it comes to a lot of the minerals that go into a high nickel battery, which is what Toyota would need for a performance vehicle like the Lexus brand, they don't have a lot of resources. They are not a resource rich nation in terms of any of the minerals that go into a car, really. And for that matter, their domestic energy supply is not great. So I wonder if there's a consideration that maybe some pressure was applied from the government saying, look, if you electrify all these cars, we don't have the electricity. We know they've been stepping back from nuclear power. Solar is fantastic, but unless people are charging during the day, that can become an issue. I haven't seen a whole lot of wind deployment in Japan, though there could be some that I'm not aware of. So I wonder how much of it is the idea that they don't have the resources to
Yeah,
electrify.
that's another good point too. And that also makes me think as well, like how, Tokyo is the largest city in the entire planet. It's pretty dense as well, so there are a lot of apartment blocks, again, which makes it harder for charging. So, yeah, when you add that, and probably the whole infrastructure and the setup of Japan isn't really oriented around the ease of electric vehicles in quite a few ways.
Yeah, and for that matter, you can't do much rooftop solar if everyone has apartment blocks. Certainly
And
not
it's
in
hard
a
for everyone to charge.
yeah, and it's hard for everyone to charge. So that could, I think, all of these things combined would explain why Japan is so hesitant. And Japan is their own market first and foremost. If the vehicles they make happen to be awesome in your market, we will sell them there too. But I can't see them getting excited about building a whole new type of car that isn't necessarily going to work in their market.
Yeah, I mean, Tesla does not have a large presence in Japan either, you know? I think you're right. Electric cars just aren't probably suitable for Japan. And
I
and
think
it's
we
it's going
got
to be tough again. The Toyota's the biggest company in Japan as well, and all the other auto companies as well. They're huge. It's a massive part of the economy, and they don't want to. They'll use protectionism against it as well, of course.
well, I think we got pretty much to the bottom of that. In the comments, I guess I would ask, what did we miss? What did we misunderstand? What factors would be holding Japan and Japanese companies? And I list them separately because they are separate, but they both may have different but aligned interests. So yeah, what are we overlooking here, you guys? Let us know. Massive thanks to Lee from Tesla Economist for hanging out with us. A pleasure as always. I haven't seen you in quite a while, and I'm glad we got a chance to catch up. So
Thanks,
in the
Brian.
comments, everybody, leave us your thoughts, your wisdom, your blind and brilliance, and stay tuned, stay juicy. I can't wait to hear from you, clever robots, on the next one.